Most professionals agree that if we're going to implement something, it's good to have a game plan first before we start configuring. So here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and click on Cluster 2 and let's discuss our game plan. Here's what I propose that we do. In Cluster 2, let's create two resource pools. We'll name one of them Limited CPU Pool, and we'll name the other resource pool Reservation CPU Pool. And then very similar to our individual treatment of the VMs, we can go ahead and configure these pools with their respective limits and reservations regarding CPU. And here's what I propose we do. For the limited pool, let's go ahead and set a limit of 2 gigahertz of CPU. And for the reservation CPU pool, let's go ahead and start them off with a guaranteed reservation of 4 gigahertz. So let me mark these off with a color. So for our limited pool, which I'm going to put a rectangle around in blue, let's go ahead and put VM1 and VM2 into that pool. And then we can watch the behavior of those machines. And then we'll take VM3 and 4 and we'll put them in the reservation pool. So with that plan in place, let's right click on Cluster 2 where we're going to create both of these pools. And from the action menu for Cluster 2, we'll go ahead and click on New Resource Pool. We'll name this based on our plan, limited underscore CPU underscore pool, and we'll configure the limit right here. So for this limit, let's go ahead and put a 2 in, and from the drop down, I'll select gigahertz. We could have also put in 2000 megahertz, that would have worked. And while we're here in the interface for the pool, let me also point out the shares. Now shares come into play when there's contention and how big of a slice of the pie a resource can get. However, I also want to point out that even if we have a huge number of shares and there's a lot of contention, we're never going to get more than 2 gigahertz of CPU resources if we have that 2 gigahertz limit in place on this resource pool. So regarding shares, if we select normal, it is 4,000 shares. If we select low, it is 2,000 shares. And if we select high, it's 8,000. So the options are 2,000, 4,000, and 8,000 for shares, for low, normal, and high. And we can also select custom. And if we do that, we can put in our own number. But I digress. So going back to the limits, we have a 2 gigahertz limit, and we'll click on OK. So here's our resource pool. Let's create one more in the cluster. We'll right click on Cluster 2. We'll click on New Resource Pool. We'll name this Reservation CPU Pool, and then we'll give it a reservation. And the reservation we're going to give this guy is 4 gigahertz. So we'll use the drop down, select gigahertz, and regarding this reservation, by default, the check right here for expandable is set. Which means that if we have VMs with reservations in this resource pool, and those reservations exceed 4 gigahertz, the option of expandable regarding this reservation allows this resource pool to talk to the parent, in this case the parent is going to be Cluster 2, and see if there's more resources that it can get. So if we had 3 VMs, VM1, 2, and 3, and let's say they all had 2 gigahertz reservations configured for those VMs, the first 2 would come up no problem because the pool itself has that 4 gigahertz reservation. The third VM, if they came up in that order, would be out of luck unless this resource pool went to the parent, to the cluster, Cluster 2, and said, hey, I need 2 gigahertz more for a reservation to support a VM. Can I have it? And the expandable option allows that question to be asked. And if the answer is no, VM3 won't be able to be started up. All right, so with our reservation in place for this pool, we'll click OK. Next, let's move our VMs into the respective pools. Our plan was to move VM1 into the limited pool, so we'll drag and drop VM1 into the limited pool. And we'll do the same thing for VM2. We'll drag and drop VM2 into the limited pool. And then we'll put VM3 and 4 into the reservation pool by using the same technique of drag and drop. Okay. I also want to point out that VMs 1, 2, 3, and 4 have no reservations or limits at the VM level whatsoever. They're plain Jane. But let me show you something interesting. With the cluster selected, if we click on the Monitor tab, and then from these buttons below, we click on Resource Reservation, it's showing us that the limited pool has a 2 gigahertz limit, and that the reservation CPU pool has a reservation of 4 gigahertz. An interesting difference with having this reservation regarding a pool versus a VM is that this 4 gigahertz is tied up immediately. So here under Resource Reservation regarding CPU for the cluster, if we look at the used reservations, it is 4 gigahertz, and that's because the resource pool says, yep, I need 4 gigahertz, whether I have VMs on or off. In the case of VMs, VMs are only going to tie up their reservation if those VMs are powered on. So that's the difference with the resource pool, is that it ties up those resources right out of the gate. So our next step is to go ahead and power on some VMs. So let's expand the limited CPU and the reservation CPU just so we can see the VMs there. And still with the cluster selected, I'm going to go back to the VMs tab here. And let me go ahead and sort based on the VM name. So I have VMs 1, 2, 3, and 4 sorted in order. I've got the host CPU column. I've got the host name column. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and power on those 4 VMs. I'm simply going to click on the first one to highlight that, hold down the shift key, click on the VM4 so that they're all highlighted, and then we can just click on the power on icon to power on those 4 virtual machines. And if you put your browser in full screen mode, let's use F11 to take it out of full screen mode so that we can open up separate tabs for each of our VMs. So to open up consoles for these, I'm going to click on the row for VM4 so it's selected, and then we'll click on the open console icon here, and that'll open up a new tab for VM4, and we'll do the same thing for VM3. We'll click on open console, and we'll repeat that process for VM2, and again for VM1. So now we have tabs for all 4 of our virtual machines. And just to reinforce where these virtual machines are, we've got VMs 1 and 2 in the limit CPU pool, and we've got VM 3 and 4 in the reservation pool. So the limit for this pool is 2 gigahertz, and the reservation pool has a reservation of 4 gigahertz. So to verify our work, let's go ahead and click on the tab for the desktop for Virtual Machine 1. We'll click on the little mouse icon in the upper left-hand corner. Also, as you're watching this video, the VM name is here. It's also going to be here in the Active tab. And then from the drop-down from this mouse icon, we'll go ahead and click on Terminal Emulator, and we'll launch GLX Gears and press Enter. And then I'm going to scooch this just a little bit over to the right so that we can actually see the frames per second as it produces that information as well. Alright, so that's going for a little bit. Let's go to VM2 and we'll do the same thing. Click on the mouse in the upper left hand corner of the desktop for VM2. Click on Terminal Emulator and we'll launch GLX Gears. And press Enter. And we'll drag this over a little bit to the right so we can see the numbers as well. And then we'll go repeat that process for VM3 and VM4. So on the tab for VM3, click on the mouse, Terminal Emulator, GLX Gears. Bring it over a little bit, and then repeat that for VM4. So on the VM4 tab, once again, the exact same process. And then we can let all those run for just a couple minutes. Now, one of the things that can happen is that if we launch GLX Gears on a VM and it's not being restricted at all, we're going to get an alarm indicating we have very, very high CPU utilization that's crossed the threshold. So if that shows up, you can either just stop GLX Gears, or you can acknowledge the alarm or reset it to green by right-clicking on the alarm in the interface of the vSphere web client. So that's been going for a little bit. Let's go ahead and click on VM1. And so VM1 is now performing at less than 100 frames per second. I would expect VM2 in the same resource pool with the limit is also performing about the same. And then VM3, which is in the resource pool with the reservation and no limit, is performing around 300-ish, somewhere in the 300 plus range for frames per second. And VM4 is also in that 300-ish range. So if we go back to our vSphere web client, and with the cluster selected and the VMs tab selected, and if we click on refresh, here it's reflecting the host CPU that's being consumed by these VMs. And you'll notice that VM1 and VM2 collectively are keeping it under that 2 gigahertz range. And that's because the resource pool says that's all I got. While at the same time, VM3 and VM4 are both cooking at over 2 gigahertz each. And so, as the VMs were launched and we launched the GLX Gears utility to chew up more CPU, because we don't have a limit, and both ESXi2 and ESXi3 had more to offer, it didn't hold them back. It's giving each of the VMs more CPU, and that's because neither of these VMs nor the pool that they're in has a limit in place. If we had a limit at the VM level or at the pool level, that could go ahead and curb the amount of CPU that these virtual machines would be able to consume from their respective hosts. So I'm going to go ahead and power off these 4 virtual machines simply by highlighting VM1, holding on the Shift key, clicking on the last VM in the list, and then clicking the icon for Shutdown Guest Operating System, which will do a graceful shutdown courtesy of the VMware tools that's installed on each of those VMs. So we'll give that a moment to complete. And there we go. So all 4 VMs are powered off. And I'd also because we're going to move forward with another nugget, I'm going to take these VMs and move them out of those respective resource pools. And that way we don't have any weird constraints because the VMs are in there for future nuggets. So to move them around, we'll just drag and drop VM1 back up to cluster 2. We'll drag and drop VM2 up to cluster 2. We'll drag and drop VM3 up to cluster 2. And we'll drag and drop VM4 up to cluster 2. And if you'd like to, as part of the hands-on lab, after you've removed the VMs from their respective resource pools, now that they're in the cluster, you could launch all 4 VMs, start the GLX Gears app on all 4 of them, and then you can notice the difference, specifically on VM1 and VM2, which are no longer being constrained by a CPU limit, either at the VM level or because of a resource pool that they had been in. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.